everyone, and thank you so much for attending today's session. We will be focusing on teaching students to use visuals and prepare for presentations. Thank you so much for coming today. Just a reminder that this session will be recorded and will be posted on the U.S. Embassy YouTube channel for other teachers to be able to watch. My name is Claire Lee, and I am an English language fellow with the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. And I also do some work to support the Tokyo Metropolitan Board of Education. You can see some pictures here of some of the teacher professional development that I have done before. My alumni mater is Harvard and Wellesley, and I was also a part of the Fulbright program. So let's talk about the objectives for today's session. I would like for you to be able to identify some guidelines for your students when they are creating presentations. You can also support your students in thinking about their audience and help them to develop strategies when answering questions from the audience. So these are the 3 areas that we will cover today. A few points that I would like to make. We'll talk about designing presentations first. We'll then consider the audience and help think about our students, help our students consider the audience. And then I will give you a formula for how to handle questions and answers. So a couple of points. During the main session, please have your microphone muted so that there is not any background noise. We will have some breakout rooms for discussion. During that time, it is nice if you can to turn on your camera and you can unmute your microphone so you can share with other teachers some of the strategies that you use. The breakout rooms will not be recorded, so do not worry about privacy. Finally, if there are any questions, please feel free to add them in the chat box at any time. I'm happy to answer questions throughout, but we will also have a few minutes at the end to share questions. So, we'll first start off with a breakout room. I would like for you to introduce yourself to the other teachers in the room and also think about what guidelines do you have for students when they are creating a presentation. So for example, I might say, hello, my name is Claire. I am currently not teaching at a school, but I used to teach at a junior high school in the United States. My favorite plant, tree, or flower would be sunflowers are my favorite. And some guidelines that I have for students is usually I tell them how many slides they need to have. So for example, I might say you need 10 slides and you must have your name and title on the first slide. I might include things like you must use pictures or have references. So those are some points I have when I ask students to make a presentation. So please go ahead, we'll go be in breakout rooms. We will be in about groups of 2 or 3 and go ahead and share these answers. Remember, these will not be recorded. So please unmute your microphone so that you can share with one another. Any questions? Okay, go ahead and join the breakout rooms and you will have about 5 minutes to share. Okay, so timing, theme, are important things that you might share as requirements? Okay, wonderful. Welcome. Oh, rose, that's a great flower. So things like having pictures, the number of slides, what students need to include in their slides. Great. Wonderful. Yeah, so we often give these requirements to students and these guidelines, which are very helpful for them when they are creating their presentations. So when we have students design presentations, there may be some key rules that will be helpful. And this is general for all types of presentations. Here are some things that you may want to share with your students. The first is the rule of 4-4. This means that each slide should have no more than 4 lines, and each line should have no more than 4 words. Now, my slide does not always follow this, but this will help reduce the number of words on the slide, and this will help for the audience to focus on the speaker rather than simply reading the presentation slides. I also like to tell students not to have too small of a font size. The title of each slide should be at least font size 24. And the body should be at least font size 20. This will make it so that it is easy for all of the audience to see what is on the slide. I also don't like to have more than 2 different kinds of fonts, the type of font, on the slide. If there are too many different font types, it can look messy and will also be distracting to the audience. Some other tips that I have is I always think that it is helpful to use pictures when possible. Now, I think that a lot of students may just see a picture on the internet and save it and use that picture. However, it is very important for us to help students realize they need to use images legally because some images may be copyrighted. So we want to teach this skill because they will need to do this for the rest of their life. In university and at work, they cannot just take any picture and use it. They must make sure that it is used legally. So I like to tell them they must include a reference. Where is the picture from? And I like to show them these 2 websites, pixabay.com and pixels.com. So here are the 2 websites. Right? These 2 websites are really great because all of the images are free, meaning that the students or you can use these images without needing a license. I also ask my students to keep their colors consistent and simple. Just like having too many fonts can be very distracting and look messy, too many colors can also make it very difficult for the audience. Now, going back to thinking about the design, when choosing fonts, it is important to use sans serif fonts. What is sans serif? You'll notice that these kinds of fonts do not have that little curly end. And this is actually easier for people to read, especially those with dyslexia. So you may or may not have students with dyslexia, or you may have people just in the audience who have dyslexia, these fonts tend to be much easier to read than serif fonts. Serif fonts have that little tick at the ends of the letters. Also, a font like this that is curly and fancy is going to be very difficult to read. Actually, this doesn't even look like A, B, C, D, E, F, right? This is very hard to read. Now, another thing when thinking about color is when I create my own slides, and also I tell my students, try to avoid red and green combinations. This is in order to help students who may have color blindness or any audience member with color blindness. Most people with color blindness have difficulty telling the difference between red and green. And so when you put those together, they may not see the difference. It is also important to have high contrast between the words and the background. So if the background is light, the words should be very dark. If the words are, for example, white, then the background should be very dark, maybe a dark blue or black background. Now, this is something that is hard sometimes because we want to put a lot of information in the slides. But what often happens is that students will write out everything they will say on the slide. The slide is not there for students to read. And oftentimes what happens? If there is all the fonts, all the text on the slide, the student will read the slide like this. That means that the student is not facing the audience, which is very important in a presentation. What else did you notice? When I first started talking about this slide, probably you were not listening to me. You were going and trying to read what was on the slide, right? Don't write a bunch of stuff on your slide because no one will have time to read it. And if they do read it, they won't be paying attention to what you're saying. And remember, the presentation is about the speaking piece. The slides are there to support, but the slides are not the main part of the presentation. Instead, we want to use minimal text. So I actually show this slide to my students to show that this example and help them understand the importance of not writing everything onto the slide. All right. So part of making sure that we are teaching students skills, not just for English, but life skills that they will use in university and in their job, are adding citations. We need to show the source of where we are getting this information from the slides for a number of reasons. One, because we did not just create that information from our heads. Our students didn't just create it out of their heads. They went and did some research and they found some information. Two, it also makes the information that we have more credible. We as an audience are more likely to believe what the speaker is saying when they have some source. So it's important to add those citations and share that. I know that that can be a lot of work, but teaching this skill will really benefit our students, especially when they are going to university. I just want to point out, you can see here at the bottom, I have this picture courtesy of Canvas stock photos. This is showing the source of my photos, right? So I am showing that this is a legally used image. And similarly, you can do the same. You can teach your students to do the same thing. Okay, so what are some mistakes that students make when creating presentations? And what are some of the tips that I shared that you can share with your students? Please feel free to share in the chat box. You can type things like, my students don't always use legal images, or you can say something like, they type too much text. So please share in the chat box. I'll give everyone about a minute to share what are some of the mistakes and what can you help your students do in order to make their presentation slides better. For example, I might tell students to not use red and green together. So I'll give everyone a moment to please type in the chat box. 1, what are some mistakes that you have seen with your students' presentations? And 2, what are some tips that you can share with them to help them make their presentation slides better? And remember, this applies to not just PowerPoint or Google presentations. This can apply to all different presentations. So students type too much text and then read them during the presentation. Yes, that is something I definitely see with my students a lot as well. A lot of text and they just simply read it. Thank you for sharing, Coyote Sensei. Any other mistakes? No? Okay, well, we'll go ahead and move on. If anyone else has other things they would like to add, you can type it in the chat box. So let's move on to the second part, which is considering the audience. We all know that thinking about who our audience is very important for presentations. However, our students are not always thinking about the audience, or they just think the audience is you, the teacher, because you are grading the presentation. So, who is the audience? These are some questions that I ask students to think about when they are making a presentation. Who is the audience? Is it their classmates? Is it parents and other community members? Is it the principal? Is it the grade? Is it you, the teacher? And what do you want them to know or believe as a result of your speech? What is the best way of planning and delivering your speech to accomplish this? So that's very important. So I get students to actually answer these questions as they are creating their speeches. So questions for you to think about. How can we help the students think about the audience? And how can we encourage them to feel confident in front of this audience? So go ahead and feel free to share in the chat box. What are some tips that you have to let your students think about the audience? You can go ahead and share any ideas in the chat box. So some things I tell my students to do to feel confident is to practice and repeat the presentation. maybe 2 or 3 times and actually say the words in front of a mirror. Another thing that I do is I have them fill out a worksheet where I have some questions about who is the audience and what does the audience believe, what do you want the audience to believe, and so on. Anything that you might do to help your students think about the audience? All right, so do a rehearsal in small groups and get reviews from classmates. Excellent. I love this idea of having them present in front of maybe just a group of peers before they do it in front of the whole class and getting some feedback. Yeah, that's a great point. Practice with friends. Yes. So students may feel much more comfortable when they practice with friends, and that will help them gain some confidence. Feel relaxed and give a presentation as you talk with friends. Excellent. All really wonderful suggestions. Thank you so much for sharing. Okay, let's keep going. Now, there was one more. Tell students other important things like eye contact, gestures, and how to stand. Excellent. And that is the topic of tomorrow's TEP-CUP teacher training. We will be focusing on verbal and nonverbal communication skills in presentations, specifically things like eye contact, how to gesture, and how you are supposed to stand during a presentation. All right, so the third section I'd like to talk about is how to handle question and answers from the audience. Sometimes in our presentations that we have our students do, we require that the students answer some questions from their classmates. Now, I like to actually give a specific formula for students on how to answer these questions. So we're going to go over the process for answering questions. Then I give them the language. I literally tell them what words they can say, what phrases they can use to help them follow those steps. And then I ask students to think in advance. What kinds of questions do you think you will be asked by your classmates or other audience members? So I'll share this process with you. This is a 4-step process. The first is to thank the audience member for their question, right? We want to appreciate that they have asked us this question. I think this is also helpful because it allows the student to have a little bit more time to think of an answer if they don't have an answer. The second is to clarify the question if needed. We want to make sure that we understand the question completely. So I teach students to rephrase the question and make sure, check with the person who's asked the question, is this what you are asking? Because if you give an answer to the wrong question, then that will make the presenter maybe seem less competent. The third step is to give your best answer. And sometimes it is okay to say, I don't know, or I'm not sure, but I think, right? We hopefully in the presentation, the student has prepared enough to know information, but sometimes the questions that are asked, you just don't know the answer to at that moment. And the final step is to check that the answer that was given satisfies the question asker. So let's look at the language that we might use. So if someone asked me a question, I could say, thank you for the question. You mean, and I will rephrase the question. Well, I think, and then I would give the answer to the question. And then finally, I double check and say, does that answer your question? So if, for example, a question that was asked was, going back to the beginning, one of the questions I asked was, what is your favorite plant, tree, or flower? I would say, thank you for your question. You mean, what kind of plant do I like or is my favorite? Well, I think that sunflowers are the best plants and I like them the most. Does that answer your question? So notice I went through all 4 steps and use this language. And I actually tell my students these sentences and phrases so that they can go ahead and answer. All right. So here are the references for today. I know we've finished a little early, so I want to give us time for questions. So please feel free to share in the chat box any questions that you may have. These can be related to thinking about the audience, creating presentation slides, answering questions, or any other questions related to giving presentations. I'll give everyone a minute to type any questions if there are any. All right. Well, if there are any questions, feel free to email me at the email that you received the confirmation for this TEP-CUP training. And I hope to see you tomorrow. We will be focusing on verbal and nonverbal communication. Thank you so much for your time this evening, and I hope to see you again. Thank you, everyone.